Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 2 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now, if you saw the round 1 video, you know that I won a pretty nice game with black against a low-rated player, an expert around like 2100 or so, and actually to my surprise, I actually played up in the very next game. Normally it takes a few rounds before you play up, but I actually was playing up in round 2 because the tournament is so strong that I actually was kind of close to the middle of the cross table instead of clearly in the top half. And normally if you're around the middle of the cross table, you have a good shot to play up. My opponent in this one was none other than Sergei Movsesian, pretty much a really well-known Grandmaster, a player from Armenia who was, in fact, I believe top 20 in the world at some point about 10 years ago. He's also been a staple on the Olympiad teams for Armenia and has pretty much been probably the second Armenian player you think about besides Levan Aronian. So very, very talented player. And at this moment, I believe he was pretty much like 2630 range FIDE, so he's definitely not at his peak. He used to be a 2700 level player, but the talent is still there and a very, very dangerous opponent. And of course, no slouch for me. This is someone that outranks me by 200 points, and so it was a real challenge. Now, I was white in this game, so I was enthusiastic. I was getting the chance to show what I had with white, and I did some preparation. I found that Movsesian had a fairly narrow opening repertoire, where he did a lot of fianchetto-based lines, but not a lot else. So I kind of honed in on a sort of King's Indian, Old Indian type of setup, and I hoped that would be what came on the board. Anyways, I played d4. Movsesian went knight f6, c4, d6, and I went knight f3. The reason you go knight f3 here is to actually stop these e5 pushes. I think I've discussed in a previous video that if you play knight c3 very quickly and you allow e5, these type of endgames where you take on e5 and then take on d8 are actually, I think they're actually a little bit better for black because of the issues on the d file. In particular, the d4 square is very difficult to get under your control, whereas the d5 square, which seems a little bit weak, can be controlled for black by playing c6. So a lot of times what happens is the black can play c6 and even tuck the king on c7 and have a very, very good endgame. Whereas if I try to cover the d4 square, the only way I can do that is with e3, but then I actually weaken the d3 square behind it, which is also could be sensitive. So these endgames tend to be a little bit easier to play for black, and because of that, I start with knight f3 to not allow that. Black now went g6, and lo and behold, we kind of, after knight c6 and knight c3, we kind of land up in a King's Indian type of structure. Knight bd7 was played first. This kind of is like a King's Indian hybrid-ish from the standpoint that now black can entertain playing e5 right away. But the g6 move also kind of signals King's Indian because in the Old Indian, normally the bishop goes to e7. So I went e4, e5, and then I went bishop d3, interestingly enough, which was a move that I'd actually used to success in a tournament earlier this year against a young opponent named Sherlev Obervi in the Southwest class. In fact, that's a video, that's a game I actually went over in a video earlier in the Road to Grandmaster series. So this is a setup I've assumed before. And the idea is basically to argue that as sort of an improvement on some King's Indian lines, that the bishop on d3 is well placed on c2 because it actually sort of eyes the f5 break. So normally the bishop would just go to e2, and that's normally the most satisfactory square, but there's an argument for playing the bishop to d3 just because it restricts an eventual f5, which is the thematic break that black goes for in the King's Indian. Now, after bishop d3, black went bishop g7, and now I went d5, closing the center. Note that now that the bishop is on g7, there's some tactics associated with the d4 pawn. So, I mean, I may be able to castle here, but I just don't like scenarios where at some point I am going to have to worry about e takes d4 and sometimes even knight takes e4 or knight g4 and just the bishop coming alive on this diagonal. So because of that, I just went d5 to kind of shut that down. d5 does forfeit the c5 square and allow the knight to come there with tempo, but I figured it wasn't a huge deal because I could tuck the bishop back on c2. Black decided to castle, and I decided to castle as well. And now h6 was played, and h6 was, I think, the first new move for me. I'd actually kind of envisioned a scenario, a setup like this, and I was trying to figure out what h6 does, because if you think about it, there are a bevy of other moves that were kind of more natural at Black's disposal. One move would have been knight c5, just challenging the bishop on d3, and then after bishop c2, going a5, cementing the knight on this square and ensuring that I can't kick his knight away with b4. Another way maybe would have been to play a5 right away, just to secure the c5 square again and control b4. Because again, my counterplay a lot of times connected with queenside expansion. Another idea I thought was even king h8. This is sometimes useful prophylaxis to get an f5. You might consider putting the knight on g8 and then going f5 like that. And so I was trying to think, okay, h6. h6 is a move that happens in King's Indians, but I was like, is it the right moment? What's the point of it now? And the only justification I could see is that it stops these knight g5 ideas that are always present in the King's Indian. The point is that, let's say if knight e8 is played right away, just hypothetically, and I go b4, and f5 is played, trying to break open the middle of the board, get the counterplay going, and going for this f4 plan. Well, in these positions, if you play f5 really quickly, I have knight g5, and then this knight comes to e6 with devastating effect with that nasty fork on the queen and the rook. So really, it's not very advisable to allow this, and even positions where you're actually able to defend the e6 square so that you can recapture the knight, even these positions are good for white in many respects, because the issue is that after you play a move like c5, this diagonal opens up so that even after a knight e6, bishop takes e6, f takes e6 is played on the square, the pawn is actually not easy to secure. So knight e6 is always this huge problem that Black has to worry about. The thing is that, I don't know, I just thought that knight c5 and a5 were a little bit more natural to play, and h6, the downside of playing h6 is that when you do that, you actually weaken the g6 pawn. So there are certain scenarios where now when you play f5, I can consider going knight h4 and actually targeting g6 and f5. And so that whole light square complex is a little bit loose. But I think the subtle point behind h6, honestly, is that it's an effective waiting move that really asks white, what are you trying to do? What is the setup you're going to go for? And I think this was a smart decision to ask me, because it threw me off just enough where I wasn't completely sure of what I wanted to do or how I should take advantage of this strange-looking move. I decided to play bishop c2, which is a little bit of prophylaxis, trying not to show my cards. The main point is that, I thought Black would consider playing knight c5, so I might as well move the bishop back before knight c5 comes, because I don't want to lose my bishop pair. It could be argued that that was a little slow. I could have gone for a move like b4, which is a little bit more natural, just trying to think about opening the queenside sooner. I was reluctant to do that because of a5, and I can't actually keep my pawn chain here because a3 doesn't work because a takes b4 and my rook is hanging. So I probably would have to go b takes a5, and then after a move like knight c5, bishop c2, we get a position like this where Black has managed to hold up my queenside advance a little bit, which is typical in these structures. But I don't know, something to have considered. So anyways, bishop c2, Black went knight h7, and I think this is where I kind of got a clear picture of what Black was trying to do, because now he's basically teasing this f5 idea, and also he's managed to stop me from playing knight g5. And in some positions, he might even consider a move like knight g5 to be an interesting move. Like if the position actually closes, if he goes f5 and f4, maybe the knight comes to g5. Maybe the pawn on h6 just supports a later g5 advance. So there were some ideas with h6 and knight h7 that, were kind of menacing. And this is always the thing when you're playing the King's Indian, is you have with white this really nice center, but you have to always be worried about this f5 break, and you have to wonder if your king is going to just get checkmated with the impending attack. So, yeah, so in this situation, I was still kind of thinking that g6 was a little bit of a weak point in particular because black played h6. So I still was a little bit on autopilot from the standpoint of training my eyes on f5 and, again, the weak light squares because of h6. So what I decided to do was to try and punish this a little bit, but it turned out to be a big mistake. And the move I played was g3. Now g3 looks a little bit strange, pushing a pawn in front of your king, especially when black is trying to, essentially create an onslaught on the king side. But it did have an idea, and the idea was this knight h4 move. So if black plays f5 right away, I actually have a really interesting plan with knight h4, and you can see that g6 is hanging and f5 is hanging at the same time, and white would actually be better here, I believe, because you have a situation where if the g pawn moves, I could just take on f5, and if f takes e4, I could take on g6 and then recapture on e4 later. So actually, if g3 actually does kind of stop the f5 move, but the issue is that it does create a hook, and black does not have to play f5 right away. And this is actually what I completely overlooked, because as soon as I made g3, as soon as I made the move, I realized that I'd made a huge mistake. And the reason I made a mistake was because of the move knight b6. And this is a super, super strong move, because the point is that you get another piece into the fire to support this f5 push, and you actually attack my c4 pawn with tempo. So any other move, honestly, I would have played knight h4, and I would have been quite happy with my position. Like, if a5 is played, I would go knight h4 probably. And now f5 is just an impossibility because g6 is too weak. And note that challenging this knight with g5 is also not going to happen, because then my knight would dart into the f5 square. So pretty much any other move that doesn't attack one of my pieces, I'd go knight h4, but this knight b6 is played with tempo, and it stops me from getting that move in. And then because I have to wind up defending this pawn, which I did by playing knight d2, I'm totally discombobulated now and don't get the setup I wanted. Note that if I played b3, the other way to defend the pawn, I open up this entire diagonal for the bishop on g7, and I was really fearful of f5 coming now when it just looked extremely uncomfortable. I thought knight h4 I was not in time for anymore, and then a move like queen e8 might be sufficient. But even here, I don't know, my knight on h4 is not so bad. So maybe I should have actually considered keeping my knight on f3 to go knight h4, but I thought now I had to sort of defend and bunker down, and I don't know, I got into a very defensive mindset because knight b6 was a real shock to the system. Anyways, what happens after this move is it sort of precipitates an onslaught of activity, and it's kind of like the momentum totally flips, because now black plays bishop h3, another tempo-gaining move, hitting my rook on f1, and now I have to move to e1. Another thing just to note that made knight b6 so annoying is that there are a lot of positions where I also might consider going king h1 and knight g1, or even king g2 and knight g1, and then the reason g3 wouldn't be so bad is because the square on h3 is actually covered. But because of this knight b6 tempo gainer and knight d2, he actually gets to the g2 square before, or gets to the h3 square before I'm able to cover it with my king or my knight. So that's the other problem, is now the light squares are actually, taking advantage of, whereas I didn't think that would happen. So anyways, rook e1, and now black went f5, and you could just see it's like boom, 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 like all in succession, and it's a bummer. I'm on the back foot, and Sergei really just sees the initiative. That's what the strong players do. And now the other thing I have to worry about in some positions is this knight on h7 maybe taking advantage of another sensitive light square. So really just a lot of things I have to worry about. And now also I have to be concerned with f4 as well. So I played b4 now. I mean, trying to get on with my own play, but you can argue that b4 should have been played like 5 moves ago instead of this bishop c2 retreat that I wound up doing, because now I'm trying to desperately get some counterplay on the queen side before black, storms me on the king side. And the computer might even evaluate this position to be not so bad for white, that like it's not losing or anything, but practically speaking, this is just a total nightmare of a scenario where black kind of has a free hand on the king side before white has really gotten anything going on the other side of the board. So after b4, black went knight d7. I think that's a reasonable move. This knight on b6 is a very, very bad piece, actually. It's almost like a knight in the Alekhine, where the knight starts on g8 and then it goes to f6, d7. Well, no, it doesn't go to d7. It goes to d5 and then b6, and it's really restricted there. And so it's really nice that he tries to fix that before it becomes a real problem. I went bishop d3 now. I don't even remember why I did that move right now, but I think one of the ideas was actually to just evict this f1 or this h3 bishop. So bishop f1, I think, might have been an idea, just to trade this bishop, which in many positions, the light squared bishop is the key to King's Indian style attacks, and if you're able to get rid of it, a lot of times you're able to weather the storm. So I think that might have been one idea behind it. All right, a5 was played, undermining my chain. Makes a lot of sense because, again, because my rook isn't connected to a heavy piece and it's not protected, I can't reinforce the center with a3. And I really don't want to budge, because then I give black the c5 square, but I kind of have to. I went b takes a5, and then black went knight g5, which I think is a really nice finesse, just getting this knight into the game, eyeing some important squares, and also just pointing out that this a5 pawn isn't really going anywhere. I mean, now that this knight is on g5, I can't really pretend to defend it with knight b3, because knight f3 check becomes a serious threat after the f-file is open. So right now, I mean, a move like f4 would be pretty dangerous, and then if f takes g3, knight f3 check next, and black is going to win this one in this type of scenario, because the pawn might can get to f3, or black just wins material. And you can see all these sensitive light squares are just too much for me to handle. So instead of knight b3, after knight g5, I went bishop f1, again trying to get these bishops off the board. Black went f4, pushing forward. It makes a lot of sense, just trying to, even think about sometimes creating what I call a thorn pawn, which is if a pawn gets to like one of these squares like f3, h3, it's almost like a mating pawn. It creates a very annoying mating idea as if the queen ever got to g2. So very, very dangerous pawn potentially on f3. But also this is positive pawn tension for black from the standpoint that black can actually take on g3 and open the f-file whenever he wants. And I'm not going to dare take on f4, because that would surrender the e5 square to black's minor pieces and the whole diagonal to this bishop on g7. So that's actually the huge problem with this King's Indian structure when, the diagonal's open is, I never really want to play e takes f5, because it kind of looks like suicide. I mean, if I take it and then he takes with the g-pawn and then plays e4, this bishop is just a monster. So huge, huge issues there. So anyways, bishop f1, f4. I played f3. I just did not want to see a pawn land on f3, because I thought I wouldn't be able to get out of mating ideas. So I decided to try and, seize some of control of the light squares on my king side, but still playing from the back foot here. And now black went knight f6, getting another piece closer to the flames. Now, knight h5 might be an idea, training on g3. Again, playing g takes f4 doesn't look super appealing, because this bishop would then reign supreme after e takes f4. And I'm just desperately trying to get pieces into the game, but it's kind of tough. I went bishop takes h3, trying to just at least trade those bishops. And after knight takes h3, I went king g2. And then black went back with knight g5. And I think this is actually one of the critical positions of the game, because I have managed to get a little bit more light square control in my position. And the real question is, whether or not I can close the king side or not. Because if I can close the king side successfully without getting my king checkmated, I do have a space advantage on the queen side that I can play on. But the question is whether I can do this successfully. So we already point out that g takes f4 is not really a possibility because it just opens up this whole diagonal. But I was thinking whether I can play g4 or not. I played h4, and this was a problem because it allowed knight gh7, and okay, maybe this wasn't the problem. The next move I went g4, and here was the issue, in fact, is I actually missed a very important detail, which was the move knight takes g4. And the issue is that this queen comes in with decisive effect, and even though I'm up a piece, black's pawns become too much of a factor, and my king is too naked, and I don't have enough cover to get my king safe before it's too late. So before we get down that line, I just want to take a look here and ask, well, we said h4, we want to play g4, but h4 didn't quite work with g4. But it really begs the question, maybe g4 right away would have worked. Because the difference here is that if a potential sacrifice comes on g4 with knight takes g4, after f takes g4, the queen is not coming in right away. So it might be a scenario where because the queen's not darting in, it might be something that white can get away with. Note that f3 check can be played here, but I think white has some options here. I can either go king h1. I might even be able to potentially step up with king g3. And in both cases, it doesn't seem at the moment that that white is losing or falling prey to some decisive attack. And if I'm able to consolidate with a move like rook f1, maybe take the pawn, I survive. So when I was looking at this with the computer, actually g4 was a playable move, but it was not h4. With h4 it did not work, basically. And the reason for that is when I play h4 and the knight goes back, this queen can come to h4 in one move. And that's kind of the key thing. So actually, one of the lines I was looking at was actually after g4, if h5, now I can just play h3 and kind of hold the fort together, I believe, because again, the queen's not coming in one move. And then if I get to play rook h1 and knight f1 or something along these lines, I might wind up surviving. So even though black managed to get all this play on the king side, it wasn't like a huge problem once I managed to trade the light squared bishops. And that old maxim I noted, maybe like 5 minutes ago, that if you get rid of the light squared bishops, if you get rid of black's light squared bishop in a king's Indian, normally the attack does not crash through, would have held true here. But alas, it did not. So I played h4, knight gh7, and after g4, knight takes was a cold shower because, well, I have to take the knight and kind of deal with the consequences. I played f takes g4, and after queen takes h4, now you see the dust is settled, and there are two really big threats. One is queen g3 check. That's a huge one. Another is f3 check. Because the point is that after knight takes f3, the g4 pawn is hanging, and then the knight is lost. And then there's also knight g5. So pretty soon it looks like all of black's pieces could play. And black already has, well, how many pawns is black already is going to get 2 pawns for the piece and probably more. So this is a huge problem. So I thought that f3 check was the most dangerous plan. So I went knight f3, just covering that. But this allows queen takes g4 check. And after king f2, now you can see that black has multiple protected passed pawns that are begging to be pushed. And my king is not getting any refuge anytime soon. Knight g5 was played. Excellent move, getting that knight into the game. Note that if you played a move like g5, now I can fight back with a move like rook g1 and at least stymie the g-pawn advance, because if a queen retreats, let's say queen d7, I have knight h2, and all of a sudden I'm kind of trying to blockade the pawns. I mean, black is probably still better here, but at least the pawns are held up. So knight g5 is a great move, just making sure that I don't get this rook g1 stuff in. Because after knight g5, if rook g1, there's knight h3 check, and that's a terrible, terrible fork. So I took on g5, and now queen g3 check was played, and that was another very, very key move. Note that if you take on g5 with the queen, again, now I can play queen f3, and the f pawn is held up. The g pawn will be held up after I go rook g1, and I live to fight many, many more moves. So queen g3 check is a very important intermezzo, because now the king is forced to a very, very uncomfortable square. And I went to e2 because if I go king f1, black can actually win on the spot, not by taking on g5, but by going f3. And after f3, now queen g2 mate is a threat. Pawn f2 and queen g1 check is a threat. And this knight on g5 is also still going to be captured at black's leisure, pretty much. So huge, huge problems there. An excellent intermediate move, queen g3 check. I went king e2, just I got to stay on the run. And now f3 check was played. Really, really good move. Again, very important not to allow white to blockade the f3 pawn. So really, really good decision making. I went king d2, scooting, booting it towards the queen side, but this is not going to work. After h takes g5, now you can see that rook g1 does not have the same effect it would have had a few moves ago, because I haven't managed to blockade on the light squares, and so g4 is going to come, and as long as these pawns are connected and they march, I'm not going to be able to survive because it's going to be too much. And maybe even this bishop on g7 can get in the game on h6 because it's not totally shut down. I went rook b1, trying to get some counterplay on the b7 pawn because I kind of recognize that I can't stop these pawns. I can only hope to create some distractions, so that's what I tried to do with rook b1. Queen g2 check was played. I went king d3. Very funny place for the king, but at least for the moment I've managed to secure a touch of shelter. But now f2, and you can see now that my rook is kind of forced to the back rank with rook f1 because f1 queen was a threat. And see, my pieces are just so tied down, it's just brutal. g4 is played. Kind of a demoralizing move, frankly. Now, there's already a pass pawn on f2. Now this other one comes to support it, and yeah, this is just totally off the rails. You could even argue that I could resign here, but I decided to give it a few more moves just because, he didn't defend b7, so I thought I might as well try. So I went rook takes b7, taking a pawn that, I thought could be meaningful later in the game. If he's going to surrender his whole queen side, maybe I could sack my rook for one of his pawns and survive, right? That was the mindset. But now g3 was played, and it's just too much. Basically, there are even threats now of queen takes f1 and g2 at certain junctures, and it's just too much. As soon as this queen moves, g2 is going to be a huge problem. So I went rook takes c7, just taking another pawn kind of in vain, and now queen f3 check was played, and, well, after queen f3, I resigned because, I still need to try and hold this blockade on f1, but if I play queen takes f3, after rook takes f3, g2 is coming next, and if I go king e2, temporarily, maybe corralling g2, maybe not actually, you can play g2 anyway here, but also the c3 knight is hanging, and, well, I would be down a rook, and there's still, well, I'm not down a rook, but I will be down a rook soon enough with these connected pass pawns, so decided to, show a little bit of respect and not play on the completely lost position after queen f3 check. Tough game for me. I think it was a valuable lesson, kind of understanding that not to create a hook on the king side. I think this g3 move that I made, pushing my own pawn when I knew that f5 was in the cards, was something that was a risky decision that I should have thought over more, especially because right after I played g3, I saw Movsesian's move, knight b6, that turned the tables. So it was just kind of an unfortunate oversight that shouldn't really happen at this level. That being said, I think that I did guess correctly. I guess it's opening correctly, which is always a good sign. And I actually did get the position that I kind of wanted. but in the position that I wanted, he played a fairly like nebulous move that I hadn't really totally understood, and then I went down relatively quickly. So I think it's another reminder to actually take your time once you're confused, because it can make all the difference between reacting well and reacting really poorly. And I kind of reacted very poorly. So, any case, very strong Grandmaster. It happens sometimes, and you have to move on. It's a long tournament, and there are many more rounds to kind of get your head right and figure things out. So that was my approach. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster, you could do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Take care.